looks like we're live. All right. No? Are you seeing us live or no on YouTube?
Yeah, it came up.
Okay.
So we're actually, just so everyone knows, we're currently live on YouTube. So that's where things are at.
Great. We'll give folks a couple more minutes to join, and we'll go ahead and get started.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the second live stream that is hosted by Black Rose Anarchist Federation, Federación Anarquista Rosa Negra. My name is Lisette, and I'll be moderating today's panel on internationalism and COVID-19. So we want to start by acknowledging that this, the toll that this disease has taken on a lot of people that might be watching, and we offer condolences to anyone who has lost friends, family members, and loved ones. The outbreak of the novel coronavirus has upended the lives of millions of people around the globe. It's changed our daily habits. It's brought whole economies to a standstill, and it's taken the lives of hundreds and thousands. As anarchist communists and as internationalists, we feel that organizing an event like this is of paramount importance at this time. Clearly, this is a virus that does not recognize the arbitrary borders that were maintained by nation states. And in order to mount an effective response to this crisis, we must in the same way embrace the international nature of the working class. So do we, as anarchist communists, understand and name this moment? What points of shared analysis can we use to build the internationalist response to this international pandemic? To help us tackle these questions, I'd like to start by welcoming our panelists. Andrew from Workers' Solidarity Movement in Ireland. Thank you so much for being here. Would you like to introduce yourself? Yeah.
So I've been involved in the WSM in Ireland since the early 1990s, actually since the first Gulf War. And nowadays I mostly do anarchist journalism. I write some writing stuff. And I've spent quite a lot of time analyzing COVID, both in Ireland and internationally, and the political reaction to it. So.
Thank you, Andrew. Next, I'd like to welcome Warren from Zabalaza, Anarchist Communist Front in South Africa. Warren, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you. Hi, everybody. Warren McGregor from Zabalaza in South Africa. I've been with him for plus minus the last 13 years and work exclusively, I guess, in trade union and working class education. Thanks very much for having me.
Thank you, Warren. Next, I'd like to introduce Isra from Solidaridad in Chile.
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm part of Solidaridad, which is an organization that exists since 2016. And I'm currently working on community or neighborhood assemblies, which arise since October last year from the movement we initiated that month. So thank you for having me.
Lisa. Next, I'd like to welcome Jonathan from Black Rose Anarchist Federation.
Hi, welcome everybody. Thanks for being on the Zoom conference with us, and thanks to the panelists too. It's really great to be here. It's kind of unprecedented. So my name is John. I'm a member of Black Rose. I've been since about 2018. I'm based out of Miami. Black Rose, we're an organization with different locals, federated locals around the United States, Seattle, LA, Miami, etc. And myself, I have a background in academic worker organizing, and I'm an educator and a historian as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Jonathan. I'd like to also introduce Pablo from Acción Socialista, Libertaria from Argentina.
Hello, I'm Pablo. I'm part of ASL, Acción Socialista Libertaria, which is an organization about also the Solidaridad in Chile. We are mostly based in the capital city and in the city of La Plata, which is a city near to the capital city in Argentina. And we mostly work with social movements and unions.
Thank you, Pablo. And we also have Gio from Unión Communiste Libertaire. Hi, Gio.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me in this panel. So I'm Joe from Unión Communiste Libertaire in France, which is a new organization. We started it last year, and it was like the merger of two libertarian communist organization, Untitled Chapter and GA. Thanks again for having me.
Thanks, Gio. All right, well, let's begin. Let's begin by having you guys tell us a little bit about how things have looked in your country over the past couple of months. How has the state responded to this pandemic, and what are some of the preventative measures that have been put into place? Let's start with Andrew.
Okay, so current situation in Ireland is we're kind of in the middle. So we're not one of the countries that's getting completely devastated like Britain or the United States, but we're not doing all that well either. The Irish state, as with many in the global north, failed to see coronavirus as a serious threat until it was almost too late. Very little attention was paid to it in East Asia. And even when it reached Italy, a lot of the state and media discussion was more concerned with tourist income and trying to continue business as usual. But there was a big popular reaction against that stance, more or less from around the period of International Women's Day, with the public demand initially for effective actions such as closing of schools. And perhaps the strongest indication of that feeling, it was the early demand that the St. Patrick's Day festival should be cancelled. And that's a huge event every year. It's on in every town and city. And then when the government finally cancelled all the parades, perhaps even more illustrative in an Irish context was a call from people that the pubs should all be closed. And in fact, over a couple of days around March 14th, almost every small family-run pub did close its doors. And after that, even the big corporate pubs that made their money from tourism were forced to do the same. Now, I think it's significant that all that happened ahead of the government declaration or suggestion that they should close. And I want to emphasize that to demonstrate what would be a very radical measure in any other time and would also be deeply unpopular in an Irish context. These were demands, however, that were coming from the people and imposed through social pressure. And that runs against the idea that we need the state to impose measures against us for our own good. And indeed, because of the way that post-colonial Southern Ireland developed after independence, the state here doesn't really have a massive police or army force to impose a stay at home, like we've seen maybe in Italy and Spain. So it's overwhelmingly dependent here, and to a large extent actually originates in the population effectively standing together in solidarity against the virus. You're muted.
Oh, technical difficulties. Sorry about that. Yeah, how about you, Warren? In South Africa, how have things looked over there for the past couple of months, and how has the state responded?
Well, the South African state has been lauded locally and internationally for apparently responding quite quickly. So we've been on a national shutdown since the 26th of March. And just a couple of days ago, the state president, the billionaire Cyril Ramaphosa, has extended that to the end of April. Now, we're not sure if there's going to be a further extension, but that's where we are at right now. However, as many of you will know, South Africa is a relatively wealthy country, but extraordinarily unequal in that much of our wealth is centralized in the hands of very, very few monopolistic corporations and the families that generally run those, as well as then power extremely highly centralized in the hands of those who run the state, in particular the national government. So the country has been on lockdown, which has meant that people are still allowed out to technically still allowed out to go and buy essentials, groceries, etc. But due to the massive inequalities in South Africa, the lockdown has been a one-size-fits-all approach that has been felt very differently by the classes in our society. So whereas the ruling class and the middle classes, the upper middle classes have been able to respond to the president's call to stay home and stay healthy relatively, it is our working class and poor majority, masses of our people have been unable and unwilling to certain extents to respond to that call. But before we get into that, I guess many people have now started critiquing the state for inadequately responding, in particular before and within lockdown conditions, because of our very divided healthcare system, for example, where those who can afford it can access good private healthcare. The vast majority of our people are unable to access good healthcare. Not just that, but the state has been unable to respond to the very desperate needs of people that live in our poor, mainly Black townships throughout South Africa. There's been a lack of response to providing from the state, as well as the private sector, to providing workers and their families and their communities with the necessary and adequate healthcare provisions, whether that be equipment, but in particular sanitizing agents, providing access to clean water in particular. So where the state has been unable and has been unwilling to respond in that way, what it has done now over the last couple of weeks or so is to section off areas, in particular in poor communities, for essentially what is happening now, the dumping of homeless people, and those in particular homeless people that are suspected to have been infected by the virus. I think what is also important to note is that despite the fact that although we're moving from our incubation period into the time of apparently, peak infection, like other African countries, the state has been hollowed out to such an effect that we may never ever really know the numbers of infected people, and thus those affected by and those who will perish from the virus due to the state's lack of capacity to be able to record these numbers adequately. The private sector has responded in a haphazard way to a certain extent, in that although the state has provided provision for companies that are providing essential services and the production of goods that are considered to be essential to day-to-day life in South Africa, there are many companies that are still open, that are forcing workers to not only to continue work, but then to work in very unsanitary and thus very unsafe and quite deadly circumstances. These companies are not being held to account by the state. And then finally, there's also been quite a number of cases of very violent police response to people that they have found outside. And much like police and state violence in South Africa over the last 25 years, it's generally directed to our working class and poor people, in particular Black and African working class and poor people, and also in particular to our brothers and sisters from outside of the continent. And much like elsewhere, the police tend to respond in a very strong and one-size-fits-all manner. But there may be very drastic and desperate reasons why people are out in the street. But that's the situation generally in South Africa right now. Thanks.
Thank you, Warren. Next, we'll go to Isra from Solidaridad. I know there's been a lot of struggle on the streets in Chile in recent days. So since the beginning of this pandemic, how has the state looked at how's the state been responding and what's been going on in your country?
Thanks. Yes, in Chile, we had the first case in March 3rd. And since then, the government has responded like really late in every decision they make. And they have characterized themselves for making decisions to protect private sector and big companies and forcing workers to keep working, and also to use military forces to prevent the to prevent people staying in places where we are in lockdown. That's quite particular because we have lockdowns since March 26th, but it is only in some specific areas of Santiago, which is the capital of Chile, not the whole city. Only 7 communes or municipalities or comunas, as we call them here in Chile, and that's quite problematic because we need the government says that we need as people to prevent the infection, but we are forced to keep working, to use the public transportation, to walk in the streets and stuff. And that's been really criticized from people here in Chile. Also, from the economic plan the government has taken, there's a package of measures that protect big companies, and there are a characteristic from this that they say that they are protecting employment, which is not true at all, because they are allowing companies and employees and employers to suspend contracts with workers, which allow them to not pay the salary, um, and for workers to have the salary, they have to use funds from the which is focused or which is in the direction when they have no job, and that's supposed to protect when we have no job, but we need to use that money now that we have jobs, but the government don't want companies to pay our salary to protect big companies and to keep economy alive. So that's been really problematic. So in summary, I can say that government first has been has had really late answers, really late responses, has focused on protect the private sector and big companies, not the workers, and for them, they are not care. They don't care if we die or if we have the opportunity to oh, not the opportunity. Sorry, we have the risk to get the virus because we need to go to work. So basically, I would say that's the main characteristics of the responses from the government during this pandemic. Thanks.
Thank you, Isa. Yeah, that sounds very familiar. In the United States, we have a very similar situation. So Jonathan actually is up next. Will be telling us a little bit about the situation in the United States.
Yeah, you know, what's so fascinating about the response is that you see this contradiction that I think a lot of the other panelists mentioned already, which is that you have one of the most highly repressive states in the world with a very high capacity for surveillance and policing and, you know, militarization. And yet you see the response being so uncoordinated. So the capacity of the state to provide for things like public health, you know, you kind of see how it fails in real time. I mean, starting with President Donald Trump, right? His kind of lack of seriousness in addressing the COVID pandemic. You know, many of us in the United States remember him saying barely a month ago that the pandemic would pass by this time, you know, in April. So, I mean, we see how false that is. And so, I mean, we see this contradiction in terms of having a lack of a coordinated response. A lot of the response really is not national, but it's happening more on the state and local level with very different results. So for example, there's still a few states that have not introduced what we would call social distancing measures, right? Or any kind of like stay-at-home measures, including along some very familiar axes, like for example, cases of politicians wanting to allow church services to happen, right? Easter weekend is coming up, things like that. So we have this lack of coordination. And also, I mean, in the United States, I mean, I'm sure this is true in some of the other cases as well. There's been a consistent pattern of austerity with relation to public health, where, you know, actual pandemic agencies that, you know, are specifically designed to fight pandemics have been defunded and have been, you know, losing money pretty much for years now. And this is also reflected in very particular ways, like the, you know, the lack of ventilators, for example, the lack of hospital beds in many localities, including New York. New York is currently #2 in the world as a territorial entity in terms of confirmed coronavirus cases. It's something like 150,000 or so. The United States in total, it's over 200,000. So we're just ahead of Spain with regards to that. And there's a lot to talk about in terms of, you know, particularly US government response. You can also see a lack of coordination in terms of how a capitalist market economy breaks down in the scale of something like this. Like, for example, a lot of the test kits available, you know, even up to this point, number one, we don't have a really coordinated testing policy. A lot of people simply don't have access to it. Even if you do have access, what's happened in the United States is a lot of people will get the test and then they'll have to pay thousands of dollars in laboratory fees and, you know, things for other procedures because, you know, healthcare is for the most part a private, you know, capitalistic enterprise in the United States. So you see these two entities, the capitalist class and the state, you know, kind of working in tandem to kind of guarantee the worst possible outcome for people here. And of course, there are many other things to talk about as well. The slow response of the United States government to convert manufacturing to producing things like ventilators. You know, of course, we're suffering in many places from a shortage of those. And so, I mean, yeah, you do see this lack of coordination, except, you know, with regards to the government's economic response, which, you know, the first one was to release 1.5 trillion in funds, mostly, you know, in the form of loans to banks and other small businesses. So you see the capitalist class getting bailed out with the most priority, of course. And as far as working people in the United States, the best thing you could hope to expect is a check for $1,200, you know, and that might be coming months from now. Who even knows, right? The process is not even really fleshed out yet. As for people like myself who got laid off from work, who lost their jobs, the other option is to file for unemployment insurance, which, you know, I live in Miami, Florida. In Florida, the website does not even work, right? So when you go to apply for this program, you can't even navigate the website. Whereas on the other hand, you suddenly have a large pool of the reserve army of labor, as Marx called it, for delivery-related industries, grocery deliveries, these sort of app businesses that are very, very easy to apply for, whereas applying for unemployment is almost impossible in many places. And as far as the industries that are still active, you know, there are many categories of workers who are still on the job. And what we've seen is a spike in labor actions, right? And things like strikes, protests on the job. So for example, nurses in various places have protested the lack of access to PPE, right? Personal protective equipment in various localities, right? Protests and strike actions, because a lot of hospitals, what's happened is that they've lowered the standards in terms of what healthcare workers are being given for protective equipment. So people are having to improvise, and this is putting a lot of people in harm's way. And we have to combat the rhetoric that, you know, they're somehow superheroes, right? When in fact, they're workers like many other workers in the United States and around the world who are being subject to a precarious capitalist economy. And of course, in other sectors, like in logistics and delivery, you've had workers in, you know, from companies like UPS and Amazon going on strike as well. So we've seen the pandemic really expose and exacerbate in some cases the, you know, fundamental contradictions of capitalism. You know, we can look to people losing their jobs. We can look to the conditions of incarcerated folks in the United States. You know, a lot of them being locked up with, you know, correctional officers who are coming into work sick. They have no protection. as well as, excuse me, so as well as people who are being, exposed to illness while on the job. And if I'm struggling to come up with anything else, it's because I think there's so much to talk about as far as this topic. But I mean, one thing I will say is it's kind of creating a very difficult situation for those of us who are anti-capitalist and for those of us who do, want to push for the organization of the working class, because you do see on the one hand labor actions in various sectors, as I've mentioned before. But on the other hand, we have a lot of difficulty due to the situation of social distancing. So we've been kind of having to think about new forms of protest, things like car protests. And, this is a moment that we're still in now where, we need to consider what forms of resistance are available to us. But I think I'll leave it there.
Hey, Jonathan. Next, I'd like to hear from Gio of Unión Communiste Libertaire. Tell us a little bit about what's going on in France. How has the government been responding to the pandemic, and what are some of the preventative measures that have been put into place?
So yeah, okay. I think first for France, I think we should first talk about what they did before, like previous governments and also this government made a lot of cuts in the public health systems. So it destroyed completely. And actually there was a big struggle going on who started from the emergency services of public hospitals that was going on for more than a year when the crisis started, and then also the state also destroyed the stocks of masks we had, and they also increased a lot the precarity of the working class, which means a lot of people cannot take sick leaves because it's very difficult, and they might lose either some money because sick leaves are not paid or partially not paid, or they can also lose their job. For if we're talking about the temporary workers or Uberized workers, as we say. So yeah, from that, the state wasn't prepared at all to face that crisis. Just to give a small example, we had a special council of ministers that was specifically on the pandemic on the 29th of February. And the only measures that they came out with was that they would pass the pension reform without voting it in the parliament. So it was nothing about the pandemic, and they weren't taking care of that issue. Actually, the first measures they announced was on the 12th of March, that they would close the schools and universities, and it was completely unprepared. I'm an education worker, and it was full chaos the day after in schools and universities. Same, they also closed the bars and restaurants on Saturday, 14th, and they announced it at 8 p.m. and the bars and restaurants should close at midnight. So it was like completely unprepared, like complete chaos. Then in the same time, might sound weird, but not really surprising, but they maintained the election that was on the day after, on Sunday. So they maintained the election just for politician purposes, basically. Then they closed the courts on Monday, and they announced that it would be locked down from the day after, so from Tuesday, 17th of March. On the economical level, it was quite weird because, like on the first discourse, Macron was sounding almost like a leftist. He said something like there are goods and services that mustn't be abiding by the laws of the market, and it sounded really weird from him. And obviously, like what happened behind that was actually the same as usual, business as usual. He's giving 300 billion euros to the bosses, and is inciting people to go to work. So it's still the same. Then in late March, they voted the health emergency state, and no one opposed it in the left, like only 2 deputies from the right wing opposed it for bad reasons anyway. But basically it gives full power to the government, limitation of fundamental freedom, and harsh attacks. It contains harsh attacks on labor codes, like about leaves and the time we spend at work and so on. So basically, the state responses here is militarization, authoritarianism, and help to the bosses, and that's it. And for the workers, there is no sanitary protection at all. We've got a critical lack of masks, even in hospitals, critical lack of testing, and of hygienic products in work and in shops. And okay, this is like for the state measures, and this created like really, this lockdown changed a lot our habits, obviously, and also it has very bad consequences on several parts of the population, especially on women, because they're the people who are forced to go to work, because they are the people in the cash machines, they are the people in the health sector, the vast majority of the health sector, of the social sector, and so on. So they're like in the front line, as we would say. There are also like bad consequences, obviously, for homeless people, for migrant people, for people in the prison. They cannot receive any visits and so on. And there are also like this lockdown comes also with a big racist police violence, especially in popular neighborhoods. They like mostly the fines and custodies are located actually in the north suburbs of Paris, which is where the non-white and poor population is concentrated, basically. So yeah, that's it. Like mostly militarization and privileges for the bosses and nothing for the poor people. And okay, to finish about it, Macron was always repeating that we are at war. That was like the main phrase of his discourse. And yeah, kind of, we are at war because it seems like as in a war, the poor people are going to the front lines, and the rich people can stay at home and are protected and are tested. So that's it for France.
Thank you, Gio. Yeah, that's definitely what we're seeing here in the United States as well. I mean, the virus has caused a great upheaval in the daily lives of people around the world. And, now we've been, more than a month into our lockdown. So I'd like to hear from the panelists a little bit about what activity has organized groups of our class undertaken in your country? Have any of those demands materialized? And how has the present moment and its restrictions changed your modes of organizing? So we'll just start again with Andrew from Workers' Solidarity Movement.
Okay.
You forgot Pablo. I'm sorry.
It's okay. Go ahead.
I think you forgot Pablo. Is it?
Oh, did Pablo go?
About Argentina, I think you forgot.
I didn't.
Oh, sorry, Pablo.
It's okay.
Go.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about Argentina. Sorry, I think I just.
It's okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I would like to first also give a little bit of context, because before all of this started, Argentina was in the middle of one of the worst economic crises in recent years. So last year we had an inflation of 54%. Poverty has risen about 40%. So that's a little bit of context. And people were completely sick of that. There was an election and a president won, the Peronista president, with a very, very, very high level of support. That also meant that many of the social movements and unions who are very much present in Argentina's daily life, and social movements represented in daily life, were in support of this new government and have been co-opted by this new government. So many of their organizers have gotten different posts in the government in and of itself, like directing ministries or when opening cuts, but always having the excuse of the previous economic crisis. So they were always telling us that now the state will look for you, the state will be safe, which was something good by most people. The coronavirus right here in March and has been growing quickly. In March, universities closed. 10th of March, adopted the mandatory quarantine and lockdown, except for those.
Pablo, I'm sorry. I think you're lagging a little bit.
Let me see. There's not much I can do about that. Were you able to listen?
Yeah, I think if you could go back, just repeat. Your audio kind of cut off there at the end.
One option would be if it continues to happen, you could turn off your video, and that might give you a clear audio.
Okay, I can do that as you think it's better. I'll try again, and if it happens again, then I'll do that.
Okay.
So they imposed a mandatory lockdown on the 20th of March, and surveillance and repression have grown since. If you're caught outside without justification, you can be detained, fined, your criminal record. This is, however, really hard to impose in places what we call villas, which are similar to Brazilian favelas, but it's the Argentinian favela, so to speak, or asentamientos, where people usually live or something. So it's just like them. Simple neighborhood. So they.
Pablo, I'm sorry. You should definitely cut the video and just leave the audio because, yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I'm sorry for that. So they imposed a lockdown. The lockdown has been enforced by the police. You can get fined, you can get detained, you can get a criminal record if you break it. This is very hard to impose in villas, which are similar to Brazilian favelas, because a lot of people just can't stay at home where you are when you're living with 7 other people in a very small place. And sometimes even if just to go to the bathroom, you need to go outside of your home because the bathroom is outside. So that's impossible. But however, it has been quite successful in the sense that the curve is growing much, much slower. And it has given the government a very high level of support, even from those people who are getting hungry because of this. The government gave a subsidy, which is very low, so about $110 per month. But that has also gotten some approval, and it has also fomented a vigilante attitude where neighbors are encouraged to denounce their neighbors if they are not respecting the quarantine. So, and that's also been sadly quite successful in the sense that we're seeing a lot of that. Even some people who just went out for a reasonable reason. That's it.
Thank you, Pablo. Okay, so back to the other question about how our class has organized and undertaken this pandemic in your respective countries. Have any particular demands materialized, and how is the present moment and also the restrictions, right? We're on lockdown, how has that actually changed your modes of organizing? Andrew with WSM?
Okay, so I think it's probably important to emphasize that the earliest demands were advanced from the most marginalized sections who understood the virus would hit them hard because of the poverty and repression they face. So for instance, on March 6th, this is before we had any deaths at all, and I think only about 10 cases, there's a self-organization of asylum seekers called MASI, started to highlight that in the overcrowded buildings where they have to live, often repurposed hotels, conditions were such that the virus could rapidly transmit from person to person. I mean, typically they're crowding 6 to 8 people into a room with almost no spaces between the beds. Likewise, organizations for the homeless and for Irish travelers, who are a once nomadic group, somewhat similar to Roma, pointed out that they too were extremely vulnerable for exactly the same reasons. Around March 3rd, so this again is very early on, some of the more militant unions began to raise important questions about preventative measures in the workplaces. And certainly from the experience of our own members in unionized workplaces, discussion was starting around then, maybe a little bit later, around issues like people being allowed to work from home where that was possible, how physical distancing could be implemented, and all the issues of prevention that are familiar to people everywhere. In comparison with a lot of the rest of Europe, the Irish state acted quite fast. And as I said earlier, that's due to the massive public pressure. So schools and colleges were closed very early on, then non-essential retail, and then construction. So class conflicts that might have come out of the refusal to close places didn't happen. And the other thing that happened is they declared a special weekly COVID welfare payment, which is up to €350 for workers who'd lost their jobs, and also a ban on evictions up to the summer. And so again, that heads off another area of potential conflict, at least for the moment. It's probably worth mentioning it. This time I talked about how the repressive force of the state is quite weak here. We have a fairly small police force, not a big army. But the other situation we found ourselves in, we essentially have no government because there was an election just beforehand and no party got enough seats to take power. And actually they're still negotiating who's in power. So in fact, in a lot of ways, that's turned out to be quite good. Because it's meant the caretaker government that's in existence has had to make all these concessions really quite early on. In terms of our own mode of organizing, the big challenge, of course, has been that we can no longer meet physically, something we anticipated as being likely at the start of March. So we put in place online alternatives like what we're doing here tonight. But I think a more important barrier for our organizing is the impact of the trauma that the virus creates on us as individuals, as family, friends, and comrades become sick, and some will die, of course. And so that's, I think at the moment we're going through this period where a lot of concessions were given. It's not clear where that's going to go in the longer term. There will be fights around that, but also I think a lot of people are sorting out how they're going to live through this, how that on the neighborhood level, work things and stuff like that. So we're not seeing the emergence of struggles as yet for those reasons.
Andrew. Let's go to Warren. Can you tell us a little bit about in South Africa? Have there been any specific demands, and how has the present moment and the restrictions changed the way that people are organizing there?
Thanks. I think what is striking is that, having listened to the comrades so far, there seems to be quite a lot of similarity in terms of what is taking place in all of our countries and our contexts, and then also in terms of some of the responses, and I'm sure the comrades after me will say relatively similar things, although obviously contextualized. I think fundamentally, in particular in South Africa, but I also think globally, organized labor in particular, and the organized left is the weakest it's been for quite a long time. By that, I don't only mean trade unions, but I also mean left community organizations or progressive community organizations in many of our contexts. So this has meant that many of the responses that are taking place right now, in particular in South Africa, are essentially conditioned by the experiences with a neoliberal South African state, and then also with the private sector that has essentially been unleashed in South Africa over the last 25 years to a certain extent. So many of the responses by communities, in particular by working class communities, and the organizations are thus reactionary in a way, not necessarily in the negative political sense, but in terms of reacting to what is being imposed on them. So much like in other countries, workers are being forced either to continue to work in non-essential industries and companies without being provided the necessary and the adequate protective equipment, whether these be retail workers or workers in a variety of different kinds of companies. Workers are also being forced to accept no work, no pay circumstances in essentially a lockdown period that is supposed to be a temporary layoff. But the other most concerning thing is that we have, like in other places, but we have what is called an unemployment insurance fund, where both state and private companies that are registered to this subtract a particular percentage of every worker's pay package at the end of a month, or weekly pay package, whatever that might mean. However, the state is now using that unemployment insurance fund as a form of subsidization of the private sector. So what is also quite interesting is that just prior to our lockdown period here in South Africa, and it seems as if the state here in South Africa has essentially, much like in its economic policy, taken a scenario from overseas and then just imposed it here in South Africa. Just before the lockdown period started, the international ratings agencies demoted South Africa's investment circumstance back down to junk status. Now, this still needs to be investigated, but I wouldn't be surprised if this has been used as a political tool to continue to curtail the state's ability to respond in this particular period, which has meant that the state has not provided any extra budgetary measures to, in particular, the Departments of Labor and the Departments of Health to be able to respond, which has meant that the condition or the circumstance in which the organized labor and the left finds itself in, including the neoliberalization of the South African economy, the individualization of everyday life, and then also the state's unwillingness to go outside of its already existing budgets to be able to provide, general testing, sanitary, and other forms of equipment, in particular to working class communities, has meant that not only has the private sector been allowed to regulate itself, but it's also been looked at to then provide what is needed in many of our working class communities. This has meant that these private institutions can now set their own prices for goods and services, not only goods that are absolutely necessary, like PPEs, as was mentioned earlier, and other sanitary equipment, but then also the price of goods, food and other kinds of products, which has meant that they're going to make a killing. And much like around the world, lockdown provisions are being enforced by our ruling classes in the state and in the private sector. We are being told that there's quite a lot that we are not allowed to do, but there is very little that we are provided as to what we actually can do. So therefore, what is taking place as regards action are company to company or firm to firm, workplace to workplace responses by workers and organized workers in those companies, in those factories, at those work sites. But it's not coordinated on a more sort of provincial or regional or provincial, even national basis. This has also meant that in our working class communities, the responses have been, always good and progressive on one hand, but they've also been quite uncoordinated on the other. So as usual, over the last 20 years, periods of massive capitalist and social crisis these particular contexts, we are unable to use them generally to push for a more progressive kind of society. And our actions are generally quite haphazard, are localized, and there's very little coordination on a broader level to be able to use whatever crisis moment we are in to then push for a more progressive society, to push for better organizations. So then, final point in this is that people are trying to use social media as much as possible, but you have responses that are fundamentally classed. So therefore, you find lots of, charitable circumstances that are being organized by more middle-class people that have a bit more of a liberal mindset, and then initiatives in working class areas and with sympathetic activists and organizations that are essentially charitable in that they're looking to look after people's day-to-day survival needs to a large extent. Traditional organized labor in South Africa has been very, very quiet, but much like organized labor elsewhere in the world, the responses and reactions and the movements of organized working class, the more traditional trade unions, are very institutionalized. So again, the organized working class here in South Africa and the more traditional organizations have allowed for the state and the private sector, have allowed for the ruling classes to be able to not only dictate the terms of the lockdown, but the benefits that are going to be accrued from this particular lockdown. Much like Andrew said in Ireland, the responses, the more progressive responses and forms of organizing that are taking place, particularly using social media, are coming from the margins of, if not organized labor, but the working class and workers in South Africa, and from communities now who are being set upon by the state and by the private sector. As I mentioned earlier, homeless people and people that are infected are being dumped into quarantine sites, but these quarantine sites are generally on the outskirts of poor and working class areas. And some of these communities organized or at least are trying to respond in organized ways. There's lots more to talk about, but I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Warren. So now let's hear from Isra in Chile. I'll rephrase the question again. How have organized groups in our class undertaken this pandemic in your country? Have any specific demands materialized? And what have some of the restrictions that we're under, how have they changed your modes of organizing?
Yes, for this question, I need to give a brief context of what we were living before this pandemic here in Chile. As maybe you all know, and as I mentioned before, we were living on a series of protests which began in October last year. And even a little bit before that, we as organization were saying that capitalisms in a global level were crashing, were in crisis. It was in crisis, and for us, this pandemic is only an evidence of that. And due to the process we were living before this pandemic from October, I think we were like in a better position to take action from working class in this context. We as people organize ourselves around community or neighborhood assemblies and other popular organizations in the perspective of fighting against neoliberalism, neoliberal policies. So from October to this point, people began to gather together again, and this, without doubt, has helped us to take actions from solidarity and mutual aid as principles of our new way of organizing as people. And I think that's very important to take into consideration, because that shows that there's a window, there's a new opportunity for us as working class to take action by ourselves, aside from states and governments, which is a good news for us as communists or anarchists around the globe. From that point, for example, many assemblies or many organizations have been organizing in order to create consumer cooperatives, for example, to supply food and basic products for their communities. They are trying to get trade directly with autonomous or independent producers, skipping the official market, and try to understand community not only as people who live together in the same territory, but as a group of people who need to gather together to have a new life, for saying something to portray in some way. There are some organizations or there are some communities that organize themselves in order or around of health organizations. From October, for example, this is important for us. There are a lot of things that we are living now that come from this series of protests we were living, and already we had some organizations, for example, Movimiento Salud en Resistencia, in resistance health movement, which are organized in order to go to some communities to help with health issues, for example. They are health workers. They have jobs. They actually, many of them work in the public system. They end their shift, which are, I don't know, like 8, 9, 10, 12-hour shift. And then they go to communities. They help people for free, of course. On the other side, people are trying to pick or to consider a solidarity economy as based of organizing economy or home economy or families economies. And there have been also some proposals in order to go for a general strike. This has been a quite difficult stuff because if we go to strike, we don't have the law frame to protect ourselves and our family. And from that point of view, there are a lot of scared of or something like that from people to lose their jobs. And we all know that after this pandemic or after this period of this pandemic, the economic problems that we will live globally will bring a lot of issues for our class, because every government is trying to keep companies in a good way, and they are like they are forgetting. I mean, no, sorry, I'm rephrase that. They are not forgetting people. They are deciding to keep people aside from all of this because they need to ensure economy to be strong, but there's no strong economy anymore since 2008 and even before. So yes, there has been some demands. We as organizations understand that this period of crisis in capitalism present or shows a possibility from feminism to take action and to come into this phase in order to fight for things which go around of social reproduction, such as health, education, etc. So yeah, I think we in Chile, from that point of view, even though we are not the 19 millions of people we have in Chile, it's not the majority of people necessarily. We are seeing some hope for us as people, for us as working class people, to take our destiny in our hands. Personal, and I think all my comrades think the same. We think we have the chance to go beyond, even though we don't think this is a crisis that this is not a crisis that could make capitalism fall. Sorry, but this is an opportunity to go beyond, to be in a better position to keep fighting. And we think that more important, I mean, what we are living now, it's really important because we are losing lives, and we have a lot of people living in poor conditions. But after this context, I think we will have to keep together. We will need to keep doing this kind of things that our popular organizations and our working class organizations gather together. And we definitely need to fight from an internationalist point of view, if we want to fight capitalism, which is also internationalist too.
Thank you, Isra. Yeah, there's definitely a lot of uncertainty, and I think you're right that there is still a sense of hope, as what I'm seeing from the stories being told today in the panel. Jonathan's going to talk a little bit about what's happening in the United States and how.
Sorry.
Oh,
Sorry,
yeah,
I need to add something which is pretty important. I just forgot that it is important for us to mention, because it's one of our pillar for our organization. It is important to mention that the feminist movement here in Chile has been organizing a network of mutual aid against domestic violence during the lockdown. That's something that we don't watch, or we don't see in mass media as an issue. They are worried, and government too, only from the economic point of view or health stuff. But we have to take into consideration that during lockdown context, we have comrades, women comrades, who are living with, I don't know how to say this, but with men, people, who are who have having a violent
dilo en español y otro traduzo.
Comportamiento.
Like they're basically oh gosh, now I don't know how to translate. But yeah, like violent people that are have that kind of
Exactly. So I didn't want to finish my intervention without mentioning this, because I think this is important, and that in other countries, we think actually that we need to take this into consideration, and this needs to be like top priority in our decisions when we think politics.
Yeah, totally.
So, yeah,
thank you. Yeah, it's definitely something that is in all our minds. Women, children, and how it's going to affect people that are in lockdown. I think in the United States, Jonathan, can tell us a little bit about how we have some of the demands that have materialized in the United States, and how we've been organizing, and how these new times have changed the way that we're organizing.
Right. Yeah. I guess just for context, you know, we're having this panel just a few days after the, you know, the socialist candidate in the 2020 elections dropped out of the race. So when we talk about the formal left in the United States, that is, you know, nonprofits, advocacy groups, and certain other organizations, even some trade unions, a lot of them were invested in you know, kind of extending their influence into the electoral process, you know, before the pandemic really took hold in the United States. So when we talk about the response, I mean, the response is coming a little bit less from kind of established organizations and coming in the form of like various local tendencies, right? So, you know, in that sense, we can talk about the efforts in terms of decarceration, you know, people reacting to the horrible conditions in prisons, especially now, but obviously that was not something that started with the pandemic. We can talk about, you know, the explosion in terms of labor militancy. We can talk about, you know, this kind of flowering of mutual aid organizations that, you know, it was kind of relating to what Warren was talking about in the sense that they're not necessarily coordinated on a broad level, but there was kind of this model that's spreading very rapidly around various issues, including, you know, providing assistance to victims of domestic abuse, in terms of food insecurity, providing, you know, necessary goods to people who are immunocompromised, community elders, and, you know, this model is spreading very quickly. And well, I mean, I guess the biggest one, I mean, if we're talking about demands, is in the area of housing, particularly this idea of the rent strike that, you know, in terms of a demand, it was pretty limited, you know, even as late as, say, February, right? But suddenly as the pandemic took hold, you know, I noticed personally, and a lot of my comrades noticed that a lot of people who aren't normally political were very open to this idea, you know, whether it comes in the form of an organized rent strike, calls for a rent freeze, calls for a freeze on mortgage payments on houses. I think this has probably been, you know, in terms of political demands, right, probably the most striking one. And of course, there are others circulating as well. I'll just mention a few of them. So, I mean, one of them is around issues of access to healthcare. You know, as I said before, in the United States, you know, this is not unique among the countries represented by the panelists here, but in the United States, our healthcare system is particularly capitalistic, particularly brutal, you know, in terms of who has access and who doesn't, in terms of costs. So one of the big demands, you know, in addition to a freeze on rent or organization rent strike, is access to free healthcare and, you know, an expansion of access to testing for all people. You know, the other one is around labor issues. So I mentioned this a little bit before, you know, a lot of them boil down to a couple of very specific grievances, including unsafe working conditions, lack of access to PPE, particularly in the case of, you know, I mentioned healthcare workers. And, you know, this work, we've noticed that these sectors where there's so much militancy rising up, they tend to reflect gendered, you know, labor norms, particularly if we're talking about healthcare workers. So we've been seeing a lot of militancy from that sector, calls for more access to PPE, hazard pay, and things like this, as well as access to unemployment benefits. Something that I mentioned is really difficult for a lot of people who have been let go, who have been laid off from their jobs and are having, you know, difficulty getting access to unemployment insurance. You know, I mentioned rent already. And in addition to rent, you know, this has kind of opened up a demand to suspend payments on other forms of debt as well, other forms of kind of extractive income for the capitalist class, things like debt, utility payments, and other things. And, you know, in many places there have been also freezes on evictions, right, which it's kind of opening up some opportunities for tenant radicalism. You know, in this sense, even before the pandemic, we have seen the growth of autonomous tenants unions in various places, including here in Miami where I live, but also places like LA and Chicago. So, you know, we expect that as a tendency, right, those types of organizations will grow very rapidly. And anecdotally, I've been hearing about this as well, how tenants unions are, you know, rapidly adding new members, which when and if this passes, this will open up some new opportunities to really challenge, you know, one of the pillars of capitalism, particularly in the United States. One of the other ones I mentioned, decarceration. This has been the focus of a lot of improvised forms of protest, responding to conditions of social distancing. So I mentioned car protests. Phone zaps have also become a very popular form of resistance. That is, you know, calling prison officials calling prisons and demanding better conditions for incarcerated comrades. And then finally, one that's also taken shape is supporting demands for houseless individuals. So, free housing for all. So for example, during the current pandemic, there's a huge, number of hotel rooms and other forms of housing that are completely open and unoccupied, right? So kind of challenging the idea that these should be empty while people are out on the street. The fact that this demand is growing, it does again suggest like a radicalization of demands that, even if they're not being channeled through established organizations, it opens the door for new organizations to rise up in these conditions. And I think I'll leave it at that. So, I mean, it's kind of these demands that have been the most visible ones, the ones that have been most heard. But of course, we need to add to that this aspect of international solidarity, which is kind of represented in the panel here today. The need to coordinate some of these demands across colonial borders and push forward in a more concerted way.
Thank you, Jonathan. Yeah, I think that last point is very important for us to start thinking about. Next, Pablo, can you tell us a little bit about Argentina? How has the present moment and its restrictions changed your modes of organizing, and how have organized groups, is there any specific demands, and how are they responding to the pandemic in Argentina?
Well, in Argentina, unions are in most cases supporting the government. Our comrades who are in essential jobs and have done some criticism have been attacked by the same union that should have been defending them and that they are a part of. These demands have to do mostly with lack of equipment and lack of hygiene. When it comes to social movements, sadly, I had to be the panelist and not someone who's actually in the social movements because of the language barrier. But when it comes to social movements, they are mobilizing both those that are with the government and those that are not co-opted by the government to provide food and basic survival means in the poorest neighborhoods, where the structure they have allows for it, because usually the government doesn't have the structure to do that. After some struggle, we did get the government to provide the raw food to account for that. So that was a struggle that was successful. As an organization, we had to change our meeting scheme to do it over the internet, which is an ongoing challenge, as you can realize by the fact that I have to turn off my video for you to be able to listen to me. What we've decided to do is to strengthen our political debates, which we usually can't do as much because, especially with an ongoing economic crisis, just activism takes most of our time, and discussing the problems that arise in our working places or in the villas are the main issues. However, we were able to take part in some specific protests that have been done, like a cacerolazo, which is a way of protesting where people hit cooking utensils against each other, against femicides, because we've seen a growth on femicides, or white scarves hanging out on windows, which is something that in Argentina is very symbolic of the fight against dictatorship after the dictatorship in the 1970s. Some of our comrades who are working in so-called essential works, which some really are essential and some we believe are not, are mostly organizing there just to get protection equipment, which would be a big thing right now. We are also asking, which was indicated by the government and by the state, but then not fulfilled, to tax the rich and to really stop firings of people. In theory, they've done that. So they said it's forbidden to fire people from their jobs, but people have been fired and nothing has happened about that. So that's just on paper. I think oh no, there's something more. We're also asking, and that has been asked by a lot of people, to stop debt payments, which take most of the national income, and use the money for healthcare instead of for paying back to the IMF. We haven't heard anything about that, so right now it's only something proposed by left-wing organizations and socialist anarchist organizations and Marxist organizations, but not by a huge amount of people.
Thank you so much, Pablo. And the last to answer this question about how organized groups in our class have organized and demanded different things, despite our different ways of organizing. Gio, can you tell us a little bit about what's going on in France in that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So about France, I think we must say that in the very beginning of the lockdown, most of the organization were completely stuck, like completely staggered by the new situation, and mostly because people were not used to use the distance meeting tools and so on. So at the beginning, I would say it was almost complete disorganization, even in local association and NGOs and so on. There was a big lack of volunteers because, like, about charity things, it's mostly like the elder, let's say, that would go into that kind of things, and they wouldn't go out anymore because they were kind of afraid of the propagation of the virus. So that's it. And also because people are lacking experience on IT tools, I think a lot of people rushed to own stuff, own softwares and so on. So it kind of gave more power to the capitalist IT companies, and even, I mean, now we're using Zoom and YouTube, but anyway. And yeah, and also in the unions, it was also a bit difficult. Some top level bureaucracy of unions made, for instance, a joint statement with the union of the bosses. So it was kind of really weird at the beginning, I would say. And I think it was mostly spontaneous mutual aid moves that were going on, like in the big buildings, people offering their services to their neighbors, and some people trying to organize to go and collect some food to redistribute it to the people in need. So yeah, basically people trying to address the different issues and bad consequences of the lockdown. For instance, about domestic violence, as a comrade said, it is actually a very big problem in France now. It has raised about plus 30% of domestic violence in the first week of the lockdown. I think at least 8 women are dead, have been killed by their husband. And also there is also an increasing domestic violence on the youth, and especially on the LGBTI youth. So I think basically people and associations are now trying to address this kind of problems. There is a small network that is like a left network that has been created that's called Covid-19, which is like COVID mutual aid. And there is also more into the radical scene, let's say, this popular Solidarity Brigade initiative that started in Milano in Italy, and now that is kind of developing in France. I think it's mainly effective in Paris now, but it's also quite interesting. And also unionism started to work again, especially in the alternative unionism scene. There is this union that is called Solidaire, and it created a hotline for workers' rights during the period. So this is the kind of things we're trying to do, like addressing basic and vital needs to the people. There were also, and there are also resistances. There are like a lot of people are using their opt-out right not to go to job because they are not protected there. They don't get protection equipment. So we as UCL, we tried to generalize this watchword that we should generalize opting out from work. and it worked quite well, I think. Like in Amazon, in the car factories, in the plane industry, in the ship industry, in the post sector, we had like significant results, I think. There were even some strikes, like in Renault, even before the lockdown, like people were asking for protection equipments. And like close to my city, just yesterday, a very small factory that is not known as a red place started a strike to claim for more protection equipments. So yeah, that's basically about the labor sector. About tenants, I think there is a very small movement about rent freezing and rent striking. It is rather small right now, but I think it was needed because it's kind of a preparation for what is going to happen, because probably the social consequences will probably skyrocket in a while. So this is like preparing. So I think the main strategy of the social movements now is to try to make them stop the unessential activities. And I mean, we are the workers, we are the one who do the job, so we know what can wait and what must be done right now. So we should decide what are the essential activities and what are the unessential activities, and not them. The other claim that is quite popular, I think, is about socializing the health system and also the pharmaceutical industry, because it is what we need right now. And so we're really dependent on China and India about this. So yeah, basically, I think as we are the workers and we know what is essential, we should be able to reorganize the production by ourselves. And we don't need like the bosses, because they think only about their profits and not about our health. And we don't need the state, because as we've seen in the first part of the presentation, it's completely incompetent about what is going on now in France. So yeah, I think we need to think further and like prepare the post-lockdown period, because there are multiple crises that are coming. Obviously, the economical crisis will be horrible, but also there is a probable crisis on food, and probably big political crises are coming, like on an international level. So we need to think a lot about it and prepare it.
Thank you, Gio. So we've heard from our panelists a little bit about how the state has reacted in all of the respective countries. We've heard how us as a class, how we've organized against in this pandemic, in these times. Our last question is one that I think is really important, because it's why we're here today. It's why we're gathered internationally, right? As anarchist communists and as internationalists, how do we name this moment? How do we organize together and act in concert with each other and during this crisis? So I'd like to hear from Andrew a little bit. What are your thoughts on that?
So I think a good starting point is to realize in Europe there was no response to the crisis until 6 to 8 weeks after it became obvious from East Asia that coronavirus was extremely serious. And I think that showed a kind of colonialist attitude to the rest of the world that clearly played a part in the lack of response, and indeed continues to. Coronavirus was seen as something Asian, not particularly relevant to Europe. The United States, I think, is probably going through something similar at the moment. And there still remains that problem of a reluctance to learn from the many East Asian countries that have fought it off far more successfully than anywhere else as yet in Europe. It's probably no coincidence that that this is truest in the European countries that were once colonial powers, and continued this attitude towards the virus for the longest, like our immediate neighbours in Britain. Now what we're seeing is this disaster of various nation states trying to outbid each other for access to all the things people have been talking about here: PPE equipment, test kits, reagents. I mean, I think in any of our national situations, healthcare workers are short of PPE. These things are kind of universal. Capitalist companies are making out of this bidding war. They're selling stuff for 4, 5, 6 times the price they were selling it a couple of months back. And rather than a global response to the virus that, okay, it needs to be tailored for local circumstances, we're instead seeing this fragmented response drawn around national borders, which often, as with the British border on the island of Ireland, are very arbitrary things. Countries right next to each other are following very opposed policies and undermining each other's efforts for effective action. So in summary, the virus has successfully exploited the cracks left by capitalism, nationalism, colonialism, and that's kind of how it's getting to us. But the other hand of that is the enormous cooperation and learning by public health workers and scientists across the globe, sharing information in the fight to defeat the virus. And I think what's really clear from the discussion so far is that there's a kind of a collective experience. It's different in our different countries. In some places, it's much worse than others, but it's the same issues that we're going through. And in fact, in this moment, the working class globally is going through. So to me, I think part of the kind of internationalism, the international question, there's some concrete issues, like for instance, the reason that there's a shortage of processing test kits is because one of the reagents that's key to that is it's not just intellectual property, but the formula is secret. So only a few companies can manufacture it. And at the moment, they're holding on to that right, even though they can't scale up because they're making enormous profits. So that as an example issue is a global issue because it's one we all face. Maybe PPE is similar. But I also think it's also about the process of imagining that the world we return to in a year or two post-vaccine should be very different than one we've entered into before COVID. You know, that we've seen that things we were told were impossible are suddenly quite possible when the crisis is big enough, but also that idea of a kind of common experience is possibly something that internationally we can see movements coming out of that are much more ambitious than just going, we want the disease to stop, but also we want the world transformed.
Yeah, that's a great point, Andrew. I think I saw something about, you know, it said something like, you know, we don't want to go back to the way that things were, you know, because that was not normal. Thanks for that. Warren, what are your thoughts on, you know, internationalism, how we can work together in concert with each other in this time of crisis?
That's a huge question. I think the answer is, you know, I don't think it's conditioned by the COVID, the coronavirus situation and the lockdown and the responses that states have enacted. I think just to harp on Andrew's point here, I think what this period has shown is that it's not only called to question, but it's made to look quite ridiculous. The argument that states in the neoliberal era are powerless, that they are inept. No, neoliberalism fundamentally has meant that those who control state power have made a political and ideological decision to hollow out the capacity of the state to be able to, you know, influence and control markets, etc. And again, like Andrew has said, what this current year has shown, or at least what this current moment has shown, is that, you know, this is a dogmatic argument, this is an ideological argument, and it doesn't need to be that way. But again, I think this is not really a completely new moment. I think, you know, this is the first time that states have responded in this way on such a global level. However, what the responses have shown and the conditions in our different countries have shown is that, you know, class inequalities still fundamentally matter. So therefore, we need to get back to a class-based politics. So number one, I think we should be, if I just go back to the African condition, I think where we in Africa, where we are like, you know, doubly fucked, is not just on the economic level, but we need very, very clear messaging. And it's quite clear that this clear messaging, in particular as regards people's health and maintaining, you know, good, healthy and sanitary conditions and hygienic conditions, good information is not coming adequately and fast enough from the state and the private sector. So On a very immediate level, we need clear messaging coming from those groups and individuals and organizations that are looking to contribute in a positive way, so that our working class and poor don't suffer much more than they are going to and what they need to in this era. At the same time, then we should also not allow or continue to allow the ruling class to set the agenda in this particular period. Much of what has come from the state and what has come from the private sector is that lockdown is necessary, or these particular conditions are necessary at the workplace and communities, so as to fundamentally save the economy and thus to save the nation. When in fact more people in Africa die from pneumonia and TB on a regular basis, as well as malnutrition, than are going to die from the impact of the coronavirus. So number one, I think we also need a much more sophisticated argument for our conditions here on the African continent in particular as regards the living and working conditions of our working class and poor majority. But I think on a more general level, and this goes, I think, goes around the world, is that I think the opportunity that this allows us again is, number one, to undermine the arguments of the ruling class, in particular what has been foisted on us for the last 20, 30 or so years. But in particular, what we need, and what we've always needed, I guess, is to rebuild working class counterpower. We need community and workplace level organizing and initiatives that link struggles. We need to move away from an individualistic mode of struggling, which is kind of also a doing stuffism thing, to realize that building working class power also, and building working class militancy also takes into account the very, very hard day-to-day struggle to build organization and to build working class organization. So moving away from individualized forms of struggle to building collective working class counterpower. Now, building working class counterpower also takes into account, and this goes from what we have what the need we have right now to develop clear messaging, is also then to develop a working class counterculture. And this is where anarchism and anarchist ideas are vitally, vitally important, in that they do offer, in particular in this time, not only an analysis of why the states and capitalism have been fundamentally unable to not only develop equal society and prosperous society and the sharing of that wealth, but have been also fundamentally unable to not only respond to the crisis that we're seeing right now around the world, but also unable to, or at least have been using these conditions for their own, ruling class benefit, and to restructure work and to restructure daily life. We need to develop the capacity in the medium to long term to take advantage of the post-lockdown world that we're going to exist in. But again, how we do that isn't really different from, from the situation before lockdown. We need a medium to long-term vision. We need to build working class counterpower, and this means trade unions, militant, democratic trade unions, as well as community organizations, but that also take into account the forms of oppression and equality in society outside of the workplace, outside of economic transaction. But this can only be developed by the day-to-day struggle of building organization, building working class counterpower that has a medium to long-term vision. It is absolutely clear that despite another crisis of capitalism, where states around the world are buying up massive amounts of toxic assets. I mean, you guys in the States, I mean, your $2 trillion stimulus package, I mean, that's going straight into the pockets of the private sector. Like I said before, the state right now in South Africa is subsidizing the private sector by using workers' money to bail or to continue to bail out private sector corporations. Never mind the fact that even before the lockdown, the state had spent billions and billions again subsidizing, banks and international and multinational corporations. Anyway, so it is quite clear that we are unable right now to take advantage of the current situation by pushing for more progressive social change. And the reason why we can't do that is that we don't have the power, we don't have the organizational and cultural capacity to be able to do so. So therefore, this means that right now, this is what we need to build. For those of you who are interested, there are examples around the world. For example, right now, there's a continuation of the revolution in Rojava that has used the oppression of Kurdish people in a particular part of the Middle East to push for not only Kurdish national self-determination, but a complete revolution of their society, economically, socially, and politically. And we can use those as examples, not only of how to change society, but to look at where we are right now. Because we are organizationally ready, we can look at, well, how did the comrades in Rojava build the capacity for revolution? And I think what this crisis has shown us, and the crisis of the last 12 years or so, 12, 13 years, has shown us what we need to get back to. And this is not the day-to-day basics of reacting to the impositions of ruling class life, but then to use the organizations around tenant strikes and rent strikes, the organizations of precarious and informal workers around the world, to then use those as platforms to develop a more broader working class counterpower. These obviously can be, and should be united across borders, etc. But for me, I think that's where it starts. Thanks.
Thank you, Warren. So let's continue with that question. Isra, I know that our organizations have been working together to build power in the Americas. How do you see the current moment, how we name it, and how do we as anarchists and internationalists work together during this time of crisis?
Yes, as I mentioned before, earlier, we see that we are attending to a crisis of capitalism, which has been happening since years ago. We don't see a pre-revolutionary context right now, but we see a chance to rush forward better organizing conditions for us as a class, and I think that's an important thing to take into consideration, because to put it like in simple, we need to move forwards the formation of a workers internationalist, a workers international, and I think that seems to be like a mandatory task to have now as internationalists and as anarchists, and not only as an anarchist, but as anti-capitalist and feminist organization. I think it is important to have the capacity to see that we need our class closer than ever. In that sense, we need to identify which are the main points or the program we are fighting for. And in that sense, I think we have the chance to create networks between organizations, different organizations, not only among libertarian movement, which I think it is pretty important, but with other kind of organizations. There are a lot of organizations or feminist organizations that recognize themselves as feminist organizations and not necessarily anarchist organizations or communist organizations, to give an example. In that sense, we also see that here in Chile particularly, we have neoliberal culture rooted profoundly in our people. And I think that's happening around the globe. We also think that this is an important point to take into consideration, in order that we need to fight, we need to dispute the common sense in working class. Today we see how fascism has responded to different crises in different periods, recent years, and they respond, and they give, or apparently give, calm to people when they respond to different crises. They say people that we need to keep together. They have a nationalist vir, very strong national virus, that we need to, for example, here in Chile, we as Chilean need to be together. We are strong people and stuff, and we need to help each other, but only because we are Chilean, not because we are people, So in that sense, fascism has known how to respond to different moment of the crisis, or different moment in different crises, and we haven't known how to respond to that. We have lost a lot of field, a lot of space in public opinion and in worker class, within worker class people, and we think that it is important to fight that common sense. As Warren just said before, we need to give an example. We need to organize, to show a new way to organize ourselves, not in the individualistic, or in an individualistic perspective, but a collective one. That's pretty important. And for that, it is important that, as in our countries, in our local context, as in international context, we need to keep in touch, to know what, I don't know, for example, ACL from Argentina is thinking about, but also what is Zabalaza thinking about in South Africa. How is this being taken, how this has been, how this has been how people is working this, for example, in France. I don't know. It is important to fight the common sense, and we definitely think that this is only possible if we understand that today, a feminist perspective must be. I'm gonna repeat this again, because I think it is important to keep it clear, and to make the point. Like, feminism today, we identify that feminism is the, um, how can I say this? Is the front line to fight in our global current context. And not only because it is like it is the fashion today, but because we identify that feminist movement is able to gather together all working class people demands, and uh, every single moment in our lives begins with social reproduction issues. And if we only have a capitalist or anti-capitalism point of view from a classical analysis from the context, then we are not seeing the whole map. And from that point of view, I think it is important to have that in mind. I'm also agree with Warren when he says that government responses or state responses is not something new. We already saw in 2008 in Europe how they went to rescue banks, how they went to rescue big companies. This is the way that fascism died. That right-wing governments and political organizations think society. For they for them, workers are not people, they are numbers. We are numbers for them. We are just a piece of the great machine they have built for years for them to get richer and richer and richer. And that's why we think that the fight or the dispute for the common sense is important, because that's been happening because our people, our class, think that they need to work. They think for the work they got from bosses. But then it seems that people have forgotten that without people, without workers, and not only we don't think that workers are only those people who go to the industry, who go to the school in case of the teachers, etc. For us, worker people is also that person, mostly women, who stay at home, taking care of children, preparing, cooking the meal for the family. That's also part of the working class people, and there are no public policies in that sense. So to sum up, we think that our primary task must be to build, to move forwards the formation of a workers international, which is an urgent task today, because as I mentioned before, yes, we need to take care of what is happening now with our people. We know that we have to demand a unique health system, a unique public health system, that we need to fight and demand to suspend works in all countries during this context without losing any wage, any money. We know we need to take those actions, but what's really critical is what will happen after this crisis or after this context ends. And that's gonna be tough, and that's gonna be tough for all people, like for all working class people. Companies, we will want to keep their money safe. They will want to keep their this globalization culture, or this economical globalization culture, safe, and that will be under the cost of workers, working class lives. And yeah, I mean, the answers we have to offer are under our principles, like mutual aid, like solidarity, like organizing collectively from the undergrounds, to put it in a way, and that's the only way we have to fight this. I'm not thinking about 6 more months. I'm thinking about the coming or the next 5-10 years, in which we will have serious problems, because we can't forget that before this crisis we were living an environmental problem, a critical environmental issue, which was happening globally, and we will have this economic issue, or this economical crisis, the environmental crisis, we natural resources, and that's for South America will be critical, absolutely, because they will fight for this for those resources which we have here in our continent. So we will have a lot of a lot of flanks. Does it work? Yeah, flancos. We will have a lot of flanks open up, for which we will have to give a response, but it won't be useful if here in Chile, or within our coordination between Black Rose, Rosa Negra, Acción Socialista, Libertaria, Solidaridad, for example, we only worried about what's happening here in South America. We need to expand borders. We need to break borders. We need to work and keep working together to give a unique response, not an individual response for every single organization that is fighting in this country. A couple of years ago, I listened to a song which said, if capitalism is internationalist, then our organization, our organizing, and our perspective should be internationalist too. And that's the main task and an urgent task we have to face the moment or the days are coming.
Thank you, Isra. Thanks again. I think you made a lot of good points, especially on the topic of social reproduction and you know, the importance of it in the workers' movement. One thing I want to just keep track of, it is we're almost getting to that hour, so let's try to keep our responses concise so that we can try to get to some questions at the end. Jonathan, can you tell us a little bit about what your thoughts are on the moment, how we name it, and how we can work together as, you know, internationalists and anarchist communists in this time of crisis?
Yeah, well, you know, in the immediate term, it occurs to me that a synchronization of, some comrades mentioned this, analysis and kind of learning from each other's forms of resistance. So like the cacerolazo, for example, was brought up, or in Brazil, the panelazo, you know, like these kind of forms of protest that, you know, we can learn from mutually. And I think, you know, in terms of naming the moment, it's clear, you know, hearing from my comrades here in the panel, that there are a lot of demands, or there are a lot of, you know, there are a lot of kind of demands that are in the air, you know, among the popular sector, among the proletariat, right? And I think our task as anarchists internationally, right, so this is where the analysis comes in, is to respond to them in a very clear way, reflecting our kind of anarchist ideas, right? Because one of the other struggles that we're going to be heading into, you know, both right now during the pandemic and after, is, you know, competing with more reformist solutions, right? More traditionally reformist solutions, relying on a centralized response by the state, relying on, you know, kind of traditional forms of social welfare and social assistance that, you know, we've seen implemented in many historical examples and kind of be eaten away at by neoliberalism over time. So I think, you know, having a very clear perspective is certainly something that in the immediate term we really need to coalesce on. Like, for example, when we talk about the rent strike, you know, this is something that we should be organizing with our neighbors, right? Not petitioning, you know, the city officials, right? State officials and kind of national governments, right? We need to build this power from below. I think certainly my co-panelists can agree on this. And yeah, this is something that will be very important in the immediate term. Yeah, as far as articulating demands, and not only that, but as far as building up organizational capacity. So, you know, in terms of things like mutual aid, right? We all recognize the importance of mutual aid, but there's kind of a multi-flank, to borrow my friend Isra's term, a multi-flank struggle, even with these forms of resistance, where you find when people refer to mutual aid, some people refer to it as a response to a failure of the state, right? We as anarchists should say, no, the state is a failure from the very beginning. You know, mutual aid is a way to create alternative economies with solidarity. And, you know, in the United States, the level of organization is a little bit different than some of the other countries that, you know, my comrades are representing. So, you know, these kinds of demands and forms of organization have to be necessarily dialectical, where, you know, our current level of organization is low, but by articulating these visions and these more radical demands that are already kind of in the air and that people are already talking about, that we could build, you know, further forms of organization. And then, you know, as far as the international part, I think getting to the point where we can scale up mutual exchanges of knowledge and also material support, because, you know, in the international context, the more examples we have of resistance, the more examples we have of vibrant protest movements, like, you know, what happened in Chile last year, what began in Chile last year, this serves as an inspiration for people in various countries. And, you know, of course, we have to move away from, you know, we need to move with class analysis, but away from a solely workplace-centered analysis. We need to consider things like the Wet'suwet'en struggles over land and territory, struggles by indigenous people, like in the United States, that are suffering disproportionately from the pandemic, for example. And also considering, I'm happy that Isa brought this up, feminism, right? Kind of decentering kind of male voices and, kind of having more inclusive institutions that we as anarchists need to build, because we've seen that the political parties have no interest in building these autonomous institutions. Nonprofits have no interest in building these institutions and carrying these demands. So we really need to be very clear in that respect. And then I'll leave it there just out of concern for time.
Thank you, Jonathan. Next, we'll go to Pablo from Acción Socialista. Would you tell us a little bit about what your thoughts are on how we name the moment and what it means right now to work together as internationalists in this time of crisis? Do we still have Pablo?
Hello, sorry.
Oh, yeah, we hear you. Thank you.
Can you
yeah, we can hear you. Oh, maybe not.
Great. I believe this is a health and social crisis on a global. Oh.
Oh, we're good.
Maybe go to. Okay, I'll try again.
Okay, we'll go back around. Let's go to Geo.
Global scale.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll go to Geo and then we'll see if your internet gets a little bit better, and we'll go back to you.
Hey, so I think as I as I mentioned before, I think the capitalist system is going into like big various crises. Like I think Isra mentioned the environmental crisis that is going to be huge. We're going into definitely into a very harsh economic crisis, and probably this will bring like political crisis in many countries, and also maybe on the international level. Like I don't know, like for instance, the UN have been completely silent about the pandemic, and at least we cannot hear its voice. So maybe the UN will disappear. I mean, we will be facing this kind of very brutal international political crisis probably, and obviously what will happen in our for our perspective as a working class, it will probably be very difficult for us, like as we said, the bosses and the states will probably try to make us pay that crisis and what they're spending now to save the companies and so on. So as internationalists, I think, as we say, we're trying to analyze the situation altogether, and I think this is very important that we share our analysis, and we can start building common responses. Like we can share our watchwords and our mottos, and we can also try to set up common days of actions, which could be like a great way, I think, to share our action and to act internationalistically. Sorry. So yeah, we're trying to build all those kind of things in different networks. Like in Anarchismo, we just published a joint analysis of the situation. We also try, like with this panel, it shows why we need internationalism is so important. But also, I think internationalism in that period means a lot struggling against xenophobic discourses in our own countries, because like in France and in the European Union in general, we're facing the rise of fascist and xenophobic discourses, and we need to oppose that. And like, no, the problem is not migrants, the problem is really about capitalism, and we can open the borders, we can open the European borders and free and regularize the migrants that are coming, because they are not responsible, and we need to help each other, right? And also internationalism means international solidarity. And from a French perspective, I mean, especially for Africa, that is really going to face a very bad situation now, because obviously French and English colonialism especially made the health systems in Africa very bad. And like not only former colonialism that was happening before, but also neocolonialism as we know it right now. So we need to implement and to raise awareness about international solidarity with Africa, to my personal opinion, and for our organization. And yeah, we need to think on an international scale about the crises that are coming, and like this kind of crisis will not stop if we don't destroy the capitalist system. So we need to destroy it, and to destroy it quick, because it will bring us all to death if we don't.
Thank you, Gio. Let's go back to Pablo. Hopefully your internet connection's a little better now.
Yeah, so can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Great. In case this doesn't work, I wrote my answer to Black Rosa's host. So if it doesn't work, you can just read that.
Yeah, you sound great. So yeah.
Okay, good. So we believe this is a health and social crisis on a global scale. And this will be followed, as Isra was also saying, and as many panelists said, by a huge economic meltdown, together with the ongoing crises that were already going on, like the environmental crisis and the general social crisis, which we are seeing with the rise of fascism in Europe and the US, and in some places of Latin America as well, and so on. Just give me a second. What we think we should do is to strengthen the fight of workers and show that the right to protect ourselves is not a privilege, but a right, and that to intensify struggle to make the capitalist class pay for this. In that sense, we need to show as well that the state cannot solve this and won't be able to solve this, because they are there to represent the capitalist class. We also need to show that only mutual aid and the working together of the society can really solve this in a way that will work for most of the working people instead of only for a few. What we're seeing now in Argentina, for example, is that the government is taking measures to stop the social meltdown, but they are also allowing for firings, for salary cuts, and so on. And we believe this will go on, and this will happen on a much broader scale after that, after this pandemic is over. This is also a good time to call for some of the normal things we usually call but are not listened to, like a unified healthcare system, a communitary healthcare system as well, a change of the way of life from living in crowded, very small places that is mostly happening, at least here, to a more friendly way of life. And we also believe that thinking together and learning together about other places can strengthen local struggles. And this panel is a part of that. However, if we were to stay at that, that would be insufficient. So we also propose to develop the same demands, flyers, slogans, etc., and to coordinate general demands using that when that applies. That's also the reason that we believe that building this kind of activity, as well as the coordination for the Americas, I don't know the name in English, we're building together with Black Rosa Negra and Solidaridad, is so important. Learning as well about Europe and Africa and coordinating globally also means a qualitative change. I don't know if you say qualitative in English. Okay, yeah. So listening to you, I thought, and we were talking about that with some other comrades in the chat, that many of the demands seem pretty similar, which was maybe to be expected with South Africa because some of the realities are similar, but it's also the case with the US, with Ireland, and with France. And we believe that that's the way we should go. We should go to coordinated demands, coordinated slogans, etc. We also agree, as Isra was also saying, that this is not a time where we will get to a revolution straight away, but it is a time where we can advance with very, very clear demands, very clear shortcomings of the capitalist system and the state as a whole.
Thank you so much, Pablo. I know we have a lot of questions on the chat, and we also took some questions before when attendees registered. I know we're over time at this point, but we're going to take maybe one or two of those questions. Is everyone okay with that? Yep. Great. Right. So there is a question. Actually, let's see. We'll go to the one. There's a question that was asked by both Parvati and Barry, which is that how are the panelists responding to the rise of fascism across the globe? How can we combat the likely retention of the new temporary laws and related authoritarian measures in a post-COVID-19 world? So let's start from the top. And again, knowing that we're over time, let's try to keep our responses very, very concise. So Andrew, do you have any thoughts on that question from Parvati and Barry?
So what happened here with the police have been given special powers and stuff, just like everywhere else. But when that legislation was passed, there's a sunset clause in it. So it terminates in November or the period of the crisis, if the period of the crisis is shorter. So I think possibly the situation we're facing is a little bit different here in that that's already been built into it. I think the bigger question of the extent to which states will try and permanently hang on to new repressive powers, that's going to vary a bit from country to country. And I guess the mobilizations against that is as before, but I think in the current public opinion climate, it would be quite hard to resist them, because I'm sure this is happening everywhere where, they're creating stories about people going to the beach. And if you look at, comments on the newspaper articles, everybody's demanding they be arrested and jailed and shot and, like really over the top rhetoric. So I think the way you combat this sort of thing initially is as much about building an alternative sense of what stay-at-home type stuff means. That's much more based on the idea that it's solidarity we have with each other, rather than something that we want the state to impose on our behalf because we don't trust our neighbors, which I think is, at least in Ireland, is the rhetoric we're seeing. And I know it's the same in England. I suspect it's the same in other countries. I think that's the starting point to actually being able to stop those laws becoming permanent.
I was on mute. Thank you, Andrew. Okay, Warren, thoughts on that question?
Please, could you repeat the question?
Yeah, sure. So the question was from Parvati and Barry, and they're asking about the rise of fascism across the globe. How can we best combat the likely retention of the new temporary laws related to authoritarian measures that are being enacted in a post-COVID-19 world?
Yeah, I think this goes with my input about clear messaging. I think we need to be careful when we throw around a variety of terms, including the term fascism. I mean, fascism means something very specific. I mean, it's a particular kind of political and economic order. And just because you have the rise of particular right-wing organizations, and even maybe one or two of them getting into positions of, if not complete state power, but representative power to a certain extent, doesn't necessarily mean that fascism as we know it, 1920s and 1930s in particular in Europe, arises. I mean, even if you look at the United States, I mean, as corporately controlled as the United States political system is, it's very difficult for a real fascist to take power in the States. I mean, you see this with Donald Trump. I mean, a lot of what he wants to do is actually being curtailed by a variety of centers of power in the United States. So I think, first of all, we need to be careful when we throw around particular terms, because many of those terms do have quite a lot of history attached to them, and they can be quite emotive. And sometimes throwing terms around actually shuts down debate. Debate about not only what those terms are, but what the actual conditions that the majority of our people are facing. I think, well, responses to more right-wing governments or right-wing ideologies coming to the surface, I think, again, it goes back to the necessity of developing working class counterpower, but through the development of a anarchist political counterculture within working class. And here it's important, what I'm more concerned about is the development of this anarchist counterculture and counterpower. As important as anarchist organizations are, I think the primary role is to insert anarchism into working class movements, and thus using those ideas in the building of working class organizations. So I think the primary goal, or at least the primary activity of anarchists, particularly here, is to, through political education and anarchist political education that we develop, is to develop anarchists that come from and work in working class and poor communities and organizations. It is more important to have an anarchist consciousness within working class struggle than it is to necessarily have a plethora of anarchists and anarchist organization. But obviously those are necessary. I mean, I'm not dividing the two from each other. I think that has to be a primary goal. I think post-lockdown, I think we're still really concerned about the lockdown situation here right now, particularly on the rest of the parts of our continent. And our responses should be that, number one, we are not really submitting to the power of the state or submitting to the idea that we need state rule in this particular period, but it is to trust medical experts. Well, as Bakunin says, in shoemaking, I trust the shoemaker. And that, I think, should be, number one, a primary message that we should be using in terms of educating the rest of our populations. There are also lots of opinions that are flying around society. For example, here in Africa, it's still considered that COVID-19 or that the coronavirus only infects white people. So these need to be combated with clear messaging, but the clear messaging that is based on expert analysis and not necessarily only trusting the state and those in power and the implementation of what they do. Yeah, I mean, I like the idea that was raised earlier of linking struggles, but helping to develop struggles across borders by having, similar slogans. I like that idea. But I think what is also important is that we should be moving, not necessarily away, but we should be moving away from sloganeering as a primary form of activism. For example, lots of people have been talking about, well, leftist activists, we should be organizing for a general strike. I mean, that can be a ludicrous demand when you have no working class organizational capacity to back that claim up. In particular, no medium to longer term strategy. Well, not only how are we going to organize for this, but in what happens afterwards. And is a general strike in an African condition, something that's possible when most people are actually at home anyway, and when you have large portions of our population that are unemployed. So therefore, I think number one is that we should be thinking about actions that, again, build working class counterpower by raising the anarchist consciousness of the working class, or developing an anarchist analysis and developing an anarchist consciousness within the working class. Again, that's quite general, but I'll leave it to the other comrades to add.
Thank you, Warren. I think the point that you made of the Bakunin quote, right, about listening to the shoemaker, it answers another question that was brought up in the chat, which was, why don't we continue to protest, and and should we listen to what the government tells us? But it is important too that we're listening to what the healthcare and medical workers are saying in this.
Well, organized to protest, but what are we protesting for? So it's not just what are we protesting against, but what the hell are we going to do after the protest?
Yeah.
And what are we actually using the protest for? That for me is important.
Very important question. Okay, so next let's go to Isra, and I'll rephrase the question again that was asked by Parvati and Barry, which was on the rise of fascism across the globe. How do we combat the likely retention of a lot of these laws, these so-called temporary laws related to authoritarian measures that have come up because of COVID?
Yeah, I think I've been referring to this during the whole panel, so I hope not to give an extended answer. But if I'd have to add something, that would be that it is important to be close to what our people is thinking. Our people are thinking. It is in the line of what I was saying before about this common understanding or common sense. If fascism or right-wing projects have won field in class war, has been because I personally have seen that our sector, our political sector, many times seems to be disconnected from necessities or needs from people. And I think that is an important issue that we need to review and we need to stop to think about, because many times I've been seen, or I've seen that our statements doesn't really make people feel confident or close to our positions. Like I mean, I'm not talking about our organizations, but I'm talking about our sector, our side, seem to be more rooted in what happened 100 years ago than what's happening today and what kind of society we have built nowadays. And I think that that's important to think about. It is important to show people that yes, we are anarchists. We are revolutionaries, that we have the chance to promote a new wave of building a new society, but we also understand what the context is right now, nowadays, and in that sense, we have lost a lot of field in this struggle. So yeah, we need to show a different way of organizing our territories, to organize our neighborhood, to organize in unions, to organize at college, I don't know, in high school. We need to convince people that the only way to get a better life or better conditions is organizing is gathering together is relying in our people and being confident that only with mutual aid, coordinate actions, and also without forgetting streets. Streets are pretty important. It is difficult to imagine today that we can be in the streets fighting, but when this ends, it will be necessary to be in the streets. But it is not enough to call for a protest, for a massive protest. I think it is important to prepare that massive protest. It is important to prepare those organizations in order to have in streets strong organizations rooted in communist libertarian principles, and, and we need to ensure that we are convinced that the only way to build a new life will be under those principles. Don't forgetting without forgetting feminism, without forgetting anti-capitalism, without forgetting environmental issues, without forgetting any part of the lives, any part of any issue that affects our daily lives. So I think that that would be my answer to that, like adding to what already said before.
Thank you so much, Isa. I know that there's a lot of really great questions, both in the chat and questions that came in earlier. And I wish we could hit all of them, but I think this is, unfortunately, we're going to have to end with this question. Andrew did have to drop. So we're going to just go through and finish it up with Jonathan, Pablo, and Gio. We're trying to keep it concise again on the question of this, how we are responding in our countries to the rise of fascism across the globe, and the retention of new temporary laws that are authoritarian and relate to, COVID. So, Jonathan, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, Andrew was talking about something that was very interesting, and that is like at the popular level, having fascist notions of how to control the spread of the pandemic was really a little bit scary. Was in the United States, there are actually various plots that were discovered where white nationalists wanted to somehow harness or weaponize COVID and use it as this kind of like low grade biological warfare. I think it's important to point to things like that as far as looking at, kind of like telling people on the ground, like, okay, this is what fascism means, like in practical terms. So people who are fascists, they want to kind of indiscriminately infect people and, kind of do damage. So there's that kind of like this discursive part of it, kind of like talking to people, kind of battling this notion of needing like a centralized response, and one that's kind of filtered through racist and kind of xenophobic ideas. The other thing is, something particular about the United States is that fascist movements take a lot of inspiration, and they kind of look to particular governmental institutions, that being, the border, right? ICE, correctional officers, police forces. So at this moment, when those institutions, when they're at somewhat of a weak spot, and, there's kind of this budding movement against those institutions, really pushing as much as possible to take ground away from those institutions, is something that will, in turn combat fascism as well. So this means like really putting an effort into efforts towards decarceration, towards releasing, immigrant detainees, all across the country. And I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Jonathan. Pablo, do you have thoughts from Argentina on any of the temporary laws related to authoritarian measures, and how we are going to work best to combat them?
Yeah, what we believe, well, for the first thing I wanted to say is fascism as such is not really growing in Argentina right now. You have racism present very much, that is a fact, and xenophobia, especially against neighboring countries. That's also a fact. Now in the US or in many places of Europe. or even some other places in Latin America, like Brazil or whatever. What we are seeing is a very much a strengthening of vigilante measures. Like they are now speaking about the police that takes care of us, which in Argentina is a strong thing. I know that in other places that's normal, police, and now this is growing, and also about imposing this kind of more ideologies and whatever. What we believe when it comes to that is that, as many other panelists have said, our first line of defense are our class comrades, our working comrades, our neighbors, our communities. So what we need to do is to work very, very, very strongly with a strong message, with a unified message to build that kind of conscience that we can't allow that to stay. We can't allow that to happen. So that we do on part with demonstrations, with public things, and on part just by going to our working place, discussing with our working comrades, by them discussing with their families and whatever. We need to be not only a part of the working class in the sense that we are workers, but also in the sense that we create conscience inside of our class comrades, inside of our class. I don't know if the expression makes sense in English, but it does in Spanish.
Makes sense.
So we always talk about what we call the gray work. We call the gray work this work which is not very shiny, but which needs to be done constantly and patiently to build this conscience, and which is very hard to do because it's unsatisfying. But we believe it's our only line of defense against this kind of authoritarianism growing. I would leave it at that because I think we're already quite late.
I think we're running short on time. Okay, and so just on this question from France, maybe let's hear from Gio as well before we close off for final thoughts.
Yeah, I'll try to cut it short, but basically, I think it's a very important question because in France we had this state emergency during the terrorist attacks in 2015, and they actually passed it into the common law bit by bit, basically. So now we are under, like, let's say, permanent emergency state, and this has been reinforced by the health emergency state that they voted a few weeks ago. So I think the best way is, like, basically fascist ideology and fascist behaviors is based on fear. And I think the best way to fight against that fear, those fears actually, is to build our own counterpowers, as the comrades said before. That means, like, we should address the basic needs that are in our class, like in the labor sector, but also, as we say, about housing and about the food and so on. And for instance, I insist on that food crisis that is going to happen very soon, I guess. And I think we need to address this issue because when people will start fighting about food, it will all be an advantage for fascism. So this is how we need to fight fascism, I think, by building our counterpowers and addressing the basic need of our class.
Thank you, Gio. And so before we go, I just want to, again, thank everybody on the panel. I want to thank everybody for watching. One thing, we are going to have an interview with Warren actually in our next episode of From Below podcast. So definitely, check that out. I think it comes out in the next week. I just want to leave you with that. Definitely check out blackrosefed.org. And let's just go around and see if we have any final thoughts from the panelists. And again, like, thank you for all the questions on the chat as well. I wish we had time to go through all of them, but unfortunately we, we are 30 minutes over. So any final thoughts? See, I know we don't have Andrew, Warren.
Yeah, so very quickly, thank you very much, comrades, for having me on. Greetings to the comrades from around the world, and hopefully this is just the start of our conversation. Thank you to everybody who's listening. And I think my final thoughts are, I think if we really, well, first of all, we need to change the world. Things can't remain as they are, but changing the world cannot be done by removing yourself from it. Sometimes a politics of isolation it divorces the really good ideas that we may have from the general population, the general working class who are living in desperate conditions. So we have a responsibility for those of us who choose the responsibility to be able to infuse our ideas into working class struggle to create a better world. We should move away from a politics that focuses solely on representation to a politics that actually fundamentally, in a structural way, both politically, socially, and economically, deals with issues of oppression, whether between races, between genders, and most importantly, to be able to then develop working class counterpower and counterculture to change this world. So thank you very much again for having me. Defend the Rojava revolution, power to workers around the world, free Palestine, and hopefully we'll be in touch soon again. Cheers, comrades.
Thank you so much, Warren. And this won't be the last of conversations that we have. We had actually a conversation yesterday on tenant organizing. So if you haven't checked that out, it's on YouTube. You can watch it online. Okay, we'll go next to Isra. Do you have any final thoughts, Isra?
Yes, I would like to thank you all for having us in this conversation. It's really important and unnecessary, moment in which, as a class, as a working class, we need to get together, to be closer than ever, and to fight together against the most dangerous thing we have today, which is not the virus exactly. It is the governments, the states, the big companies, the capitalists, etc. And for that, it is important and necessary for our class to have our organizations together, discussing and exchanging opinions and point of views about what's happening today globally, and to have more information what's happening in our own countries. So I don't have more words than thank you. I hope we keep doing this kind of panels, not only in the virus crisis or related to the virus crisis, but about the other flanks we have to fight day to day in our context. And I don't know, we have to keep working and demanding freedom for prisoners. We need to keep working on fighting to eliminate and suppress gender violence, not only in terms of physical or psychologist violence, but the one that is provided by the state themselves. The conditions under our comrades, women comrades, are today, to keep working together and to keep facing each other and keeping in touch. I think that's it, and we hope we could get a larger international network of organizations, revolutionary organizations, fighting for our freedom and our working class freedom. So thank you for having us.
Thank you, Isra. Pablo, do you have thoughts? Any final thoughts?
I think I would say almost the same as Isra said. So we are very glad that this panel has existed. We are very glad that we are building this coordination. We are in very difficult times, which are not new. Didn't start with this pandemic, but this pandemic complicates everything. And it's a time where we need to start to build this international friendship again, and international conversation again, which is the reason we are very happy that we are already doing that with Black Rose and Solidaridad. But we're also very happy that right now we're starting to do that with other organizations, with Zabalaza, UCL, WCF, and I'm missing names, the Anarchist Federation of Britain, and so on. And we believe that it's a time where we need to go deeper and stronger in the claims that weren't listened to before, but that can be listened to now.
Thank you, Pablo. Gio, any last thoughts?
Yeah, well, first, thank you very much for organizing this this panel. I think it was really great to have this, and it also there was a lot of interest in our country about this initiative. So thank you again. And I think this let's say reactivation or acceleration of our internationalist links is very important, and I think it's a very good sign among the dark clouds of the current and future crisis. So thank you again, and be patient and build a popular power.
Thank you. And last is Jonathan from Black Rose. Any final thoughts from your end?
Yeah, I want to reiterate my thanks to my fellow panelists. This is, a small event, but I think a historic moment too. And I hope this is not the last event like this. And I hope at our next event, we have twice as many organizations and we have representation of non-men and Indigenous people and people of color as well. So, I mean, I really hope that we make a conscious effort to build towards that. And I guess my second point is that, even in this dark moment, I think the fact that we could organize something like this represents a little ray of hope. And going forward, I hope that even though there's such an impetus to be isolated, to be apart from each other, that, in addition to the traditional anarchist styles of propaganda and agitation, that we practice critical listening with our comrades, with people in our lives, and especially with people who are not usually represented in organizing spaces, because I think as far as organizing as a class, that's really the seed from which we can grow something that's more of an internationalist or proletarian internationalist approach. So I would just, remind everybody watching, and including my co-panelists, that let's keep that in mind going forward. And thank you.
Thank you, everyone. All right, we'll end it here. Thanks again to all the panelists, and thanks for everyone watching online. All right.